There are moments in life when a single question doesn't just enter your mind. It actually shakes the foundation of everything you thought you knew about yourself. And that's exactly what happens when a simple sentence is spoken in a quiet room that feels ordinary on the surface, but underneath carries something far more dangerous, far more powerful. Because once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And once it settles inside you, it starts to challenge everything you built your identity on. Because what if the biggest lie you've ever believed is not about the world, not about other people, but about you? And that's where this begins. Not with noise or drama, but with a question that seems almost too simple to matter, yet somehow has the power to dismantle a lifetime of confusion. Who are you, really, in the eyes of God? At first, that question feels easy to dismiss, because most people think they already know the answer. They point to their name, their job, their failures, their successes, the labels the world gave them, or the ones they grabbed for themselves just to feel stable in a shifting world. But the moment you sit with it longer, something uncomfortable starts to surface, because those answers don't feel as solid as you pretend they are. And that's exactly where this message begins to shift from just words into something heavier. Because the voice speaking here isn't trying to give you motivation, it's trying to pull you into a deeper reality, one that most people avoid their entire lives, because it forces them to confront something terrifying, that they may have been living out of a false identity all along. And before that truth is revealed, there's a setup, a moment that seems like prayer, something familiar, something religious, something people often hear and move past without thinking. But even here, there's a hidden direction being set. Because when you hear words like "Come, Holy Spirit," it's not just ritual language. It's an invitation for clarity, for truth, for a kind of vision that goes beyond human reasoning. And that's important, because what comes next is not meant to be understood only with the mind, but with something deeper. Because the real tension begins when a question from Scripture is brought into the room. A question Jesus once asked that split people into confusion, speculation, and revelation all at once. Who do you say that I am? At first, that question seems like it's about Jesus. But then something unexpected happens. Because it turns, it reverses, and suddenly it becomes a mirror pointed directly at the listener. Not who is he, but who are you? And more importantly, who does he say you are? And that's where the discomfort starts to build, because most people live their entire lives answering questions the world asks them, not questions God is asking them. The world tells you you are what you produce, what you earn, what you look like, what you achieve. And slowly, without even noticing it, you begin to accept those definitions as truth. But what happens when those definitions start to collapse? What happens when success doesn't feel like enough anymore? When failure feels like a permanent stain? When beauty fades? When strength weakens? When titles disappear? When the noise of life finally quiets down and you are left alone with the question you've been avoiding your entire life? Who are you then? And that's where the speaker begins to expose something uncomfortable. Because most people, even people who believe, even people who go to church, are still not living from their true identity. They are living from fragments, from opinions, from wounds, from comparisons, from the pressure of constantly trying to become something instead of realizing what they already are. And the danger in that is not just confusion, it's captivity. Because if you don't know who you are, something else will define you for you. The world will step in. Culture will step in. Fear will step in. And slowly, quietly, you begin to accept identities that were never meant to belong to you. And this is where the tension escalates further, because the message doesn't soften here, it sharpens. It suggests that when people disconnect from God, they don't just lose direction, they become vulnerable to redefinition. And that redefinition doesn't come gently. It comes through noise, influence, pressure, and repetition until it feels normal. And before you realize it, Your identity is no longer rooted in something eternal, but in something constantly changing. And that's where the conversation turns darker for a moment, because it suggested that entire movements, entire cultural shifts, even entire belief systems can arise from this identity confusion from people trying to answer the question, who am I, without the anchor of truth. But just as that tension starts to feel heavy, something else is introduced, something that reframes the entire direction of the message. The idea that your life is not an accident, not a mistake, not a random outcome of biology or history, but something intentionally created, something known before you were formed, something seen before you ever opened your eyes. And that thought alone begins to destabilize the earlier assumptions. Because if you are known that deeply, then you are not random. And if you are not random, then your existence carries meaning even when you don't feel meaningful. But here's where the story takes another turn, because instead of staying abstract, it becomes deeply personal. It begins to challenge the listener to stop thinking about identity as something they discover externally, and instead start realizing it as something that must be received, not achieved. And that shift is dangerous for the ego, because the ego wants to build identity. It wants to earn it. It wants to prove it. But what if the truth is that identity is not something you climb toward, but something you return to? And now the foundation starts to shake even more, because the message introduces a radical idea that at the core of existence, you are not just a human trying to survive, not just a personality trying to succeed, but something far more intimate in the eyes of God, a child. And not a symbolic child, not a poetic metaphor, but something far more direct, something that changes how reality itself is interpreted. But even as that truth is spoken, there is a tension that builds immediately, because most people struggle to accept that kind of identity. They resist it, not because it sounds false, but because it sounds too simple compared to the complexity of their pain. Because if you've been hurt, if you've failed, if you've been rejected, if you've been overlooked, then hearing that you are a child of God doesn't instantly erase the weight of your experience. In fact, it often feels like a contradiction. And that contradiction is where the next layer begins to form, because now the message is not just about identity, it's about perception. How do you reconcile what you feel about yourself with what God supposedly says about you? And this is where the emotional tension deepens again, because the idea is introduced that the voice of God is not in competition with your mistakes, your past, or your weaknesses. Instead, it exists on a completely different level of reality, one that is not diminished by your failures. But even as that truth is introduced, it's not fully explained yet. And that's intentional, because the listener is being led somewhere, not handed everything at once. And so the question returns again, sharper this time, almost unavoidable now. If God truly knows you, if God truly created you, if God truly sees you beyond your failures, then why do so many people still live as if they are lost? And that question doesn't get answered immediately. Instead, the message begins to move towards something deeper, something more unsettling, because it suggests that the greatest battle most people face is not external at all, but internal, happening in the mind, in the quiet spaces where identity is either formed or destroyed. And that is where everything begins to intensify again. Because what comes next is not just about who you are, but about what is trying to reshape who you are every single day without you noticing. And just as that realization begins to form, the message takes a pause, not to end, but to prepare you for something even deeper, something that will challenge not just your thoughts, but the very way you interpret your own life. And what comes next will force you to ask a question most people are never ready for. Because if you are truly a child of God, then why does your life feel like you're still trying to become someone you were already created to be? And that's where everything begins to shift. But what happens next will take this even further than you expect. Because once that question lands inside your mind, it doesn't leave quietly. It starts following you into everything, into your decisions, into your memories, into the way you look at yourself when nobody else is watching. And suddenly, even ordinary moments begin to feel like they are carrying a hidden weight, because now there is a conflict inside you between who you think you are and who you might actually be in a reality you've never fully stepped into. And that tension is exactly where this next layer begins, because the message doesn't slow down to comfort you. It pushes further into something more confronting, more uncomfortable, because it suggests that if you are not grounded in truth, then something else will always step in to define you, and it won't ask for permission. It will simply take over through repetition, through influence, through pressure, until you start living as if it were true. And that's where the idea of identity becomes a battlefield, not something passive, not something neutral, but something constantly under attack, constantly being rewritten by whatever voice is loudest in your environment. And that's why so many people feel internally divided, because they are trying to hold on to something real while being surrounded by constant noise that tells them otherwise. But then the message shifts again. And instead of only exposing the problem, it begins to introduce something deeper, something that changes the direction of the entire conversation. Because now it's not just about confusion, it's about origin. It's about where identity actually comes from. And here, the tone becomes more grounded, more deliberate, because the idea is introduced that you are not self-created, you are not self-assigned, and you are not self-defined at the deepest level of your being. Instead, your identity is something received, something given, something rooted in a relationship that existed before your awareness of it ever began. And that changes everything. Because if identity is received rather than constructed, then the entire pressure of constantly becoming someone shifts into something else entirely, something more freeing but also more challenging. Because receiving requires surrender, and surrender is something most people resist without even realizing it. And now the message begins to sharpen again, because it introduces a powerful contrast. The world builds identity through accumulation, through achievement, through image, through comparison. But God defines identity through relationship, through belonging, through being known. And those two systems cannot coexist peacefully inside a divided mind, because one tells you to earn your place, while the other tells you your place has already been given. And that contradiction is where most internal conflict begins, because people try to live in both systems at once, trying to earn what has already been freely given, and in doing so, they exhaust themselves emotionally, mentally, spiritually, without understanding why nothing ever feels complete. And this is where the message begins to get even more personal, because it suggests that many people are not struggling because they lack value, but because they are disconnected from the source that reveals their value clearly. And when that happens, something dangerous fills the gap, not necessarily evil in appearance, but deeply misleading in effect, because it starts to redefine success, worth, and identity in ways that feel urgent but are ultimately unstable. And that's where fear begins to enter the picture. Because when identity is unstable, fear becomes natural. Fear of losing, fear of aging, fear of failing, fear of being replaced, fear of becoming irrelevant, and underneath all of it, a deeper fear that maybe you were never enough to begin with. And that fear is not just emotional, it becomes structural, shaping how you respond to life itself, how you interpret challenges, how you handle rejection, how you deal with silence, how you react when things don't go your way. But then, without warning, the message shifts again. And this time it moves towards something that reframes fear entirely, because it introduces a perspective that completely contradicts the logic of insecurity. It suggests that if your origin is rooted in something greater than yourself, then your existence is not fragile in the way you assume it is, and the constant anxiety about survival, significance, and control begins to lose its authority over you. But that idea is not fully resolved yet, because now the message begins to build another layer, and this layer is not about comfort, it is about purpose. Because identity, once understood even partially, immediately raises another question. If I am not random, then why am I here? And that question opens a completely new direction, because now the conversation is no longer just about who you are, but about what you are meant to do with that identity. And this is where the idea of mission begins to surface. Not as a vague spiritual concept, but as something deeply personal, something that implies responsibility, something that suggests your life is not just for you. And that realization adds weight, because it introduces the idea that every person carries something unique, something that cannot be replaced, something that, if ignored, leaves a gap that no one else can fill in the same way. And that thought begins to intensify the stakes again, because now life is no longer just about survival or success. It becomes about fulfillment of something that was placed inside you with intention. But even here, the message doesn't allow the mind to settle too quickly, because it immediately introduces a tension between desire and direction, between what you want and what you were made for. And those two things are not always aligned at first. And that creates an internal conflict that most people try to avoid, because it requires them to confront the possibility that not every desire leads upward and not every comfort leads forward. And so the narrative begins to challenge a very common assumption that freedom means doing whatever you want whenever you want. Instead, it suggests something far more complex, that true freedom might actually come from alignment, from becoming who you were designed to be, even if that process requires discomfort. And just as that idea starts to settle, the message takes another turn into something even more confronting, because it begins to address the forces that compete for your identity, not just internally, but externally, through culture, through media, through constant exposure to ideas that shape how you see yourself without you consciously choosing them. And suddenly, the world is no longer neutral in this narrative. It becomes active, influential, persistent, shaping identity through repetition until what is false begins to feel normal. But even that is not where the tension ends, because now the message introduces something even more subtle, something most people never think about, which is that identity doesn't just get attacked through obvious lies, but also through partial truths, through achievements that feel fulfilling but don't last, through validation that feels real but fades quickly. And that creates a cycle, a loop of temporary satisfaction followed by deeper emptiness. And the more someone tries to fill that emptiness with external things, the more noticeable the emptiness becomes when those things disappear. And that's where the internal conflict becomes unavoidable, because at some point, every person is forced to ask whether what they are chasing is actually building them or slowly reshaping them into someone they were never meant to be. And that question lingers unanswered, growing heavier, because now it's not just theoretical anymore, it's personal. And just as that realization begins to fully form, the message moves towards something deeper still, something that will challenge not just how you see the world, but how you interpret pain, failure, and even the moments you wish never happened. But what comes next will completely redefine what you think suffering actually means. Because the moment suffering enters the conversation, everything that sounded philosophical suddenly becomes real. Because now we are no longer talking about abstract identity. We are talking about the moments that actually shaped you, the moments you still remember when everything is quiet, the moments you don't talk about easily, the moments that didn't just happen to you, but stayed inside you and began to influence how you see everything else. And this is where the message takes a deeper turn, because it suggests something that initially feels almost impossible to accept, that even the parts of your life you would never choose, the parts you would erase if you could, the parts that broke your expectations and reshaped your trust, are not wasted in the eyes of God. But that idea creates tension immediately, because most people interpret pain as evidence of abandonment, as proof that something went wrong, that something was lost, that something slipped out of control. And so when you hear that suffering might actually carry meaning, it doesn't immediately feel comforting. It feels confusing, even uncomfortable. And that's exactly where the message pushes further, because it begins to challenge the assumption that pain is always meaningless unless it leads to immediate understanding. Instead, it introduces the idea that meaning can exist long before clarity arrives, and that sometimes the process of suffering is not about explanation, but transformation. And that shifts the entire emotional weight of the conversation, because now suffering is no longer just something to escape. It becomes something that might be forming you in ways you cannot yet see. But even here, the message doesn't leave you in abstraction, because it brings everything back to identity again and suggests that when you understand who you are, even pain begins to change its role in your life. It is no longer the final word about you. It becomes something that passes through your story without defining your story. And that is where the tension between identity and experience becomes clear. Because most people define themselves by what has happened to them, while this message insists that your identity is deeper than what has happened to you. And that difference is not small. It is foundational. Because if your identity is built on experience, then every painful experience becomes a threat to who you are. But if your identity is rooted in something greater, then even painful experiences cannot erase what has been placed within you. And that is where the idea of healing begins to enter. Not as something instant, not as something emotional only, but as something deeply connected to truth, to alignment, to the willingness to see yourself differently than your wounds have trained you to see yourself. And then the message becomes even more direct, because it addresses something many people avoid for years, sometimes decades, which is the idea that unresolved pain does not disappear on its own. It influences everything silently in the background, shaping reactions, decisions, relationships, and even beliefs about God. And so the conversation shifts into something more serious, because now it is not just about identity in theory. It is about whether you are actually living from a healed identity or from a wounded one that has never been fully surrendered or understood. And that is where forgiveness enters the picture, not as a suggestion, but as a necessity tied directly to spiritual freedom. But immediately, that idea creates resistance, because forgiveness is often misunderstood as agreement or weakness or forgetting or excusing what happened. And so the message has to confront that misunderstanding directly, and it does so by separating emotional readiness from intentional choice, because it suggests that forgiveness is not something you wait to feel. It is something you decide to do, even when feelings are still unresolved, even when memory still carries weight, even when emotions are still active. And that distinction changes everything, because it removes forgiveness from the realm of emotional permission and places it into the realm of will, decision, and spiritual alignment. And then the message deepens that idea even further by introducing a contrast between justice and mercy, showing that justice gives what is due, but mercy releases someone from what is due. And forgiveness becomes the act of stepping into that same pattern of mercy. But this is where the teaching becomes most confronting, because it suggests that holding on to unforgiveness does not just affect the other person, it affects the one carrying it, keeping them emotionally bound to moments that should have already been released. And suddenly forgiveness is no longer just a moral instruction, it becomes a key to internal freedom. But even as that idea is introduced, it is not left theoretical, because the message brings it into the most extreme example possible, the image of suffering at its peak, where pain is not only physical, but emotional, relational, and spiritual all at once. And in that moment, the narrative points toward the cross, not as a symbol alone, but as the ultimate expression of innocence, suffering, without revenge, without retaliation, without holding on to bitterness, and instead choosing forgiveness even in the middle of unimaginable pain. And that is where the tension reaches a new level, because it forces the listener to ask how such a response is even possible under that kind of suffering. And the answer according to the message, is that it is not based on emotion, but on decision, a willful act that overrides instinct, pain, and human reaction. And that creates a challenge for the listener, because now the question becomes personal again. If that kind of forgiveness is possible in the most extreme circumstances, then what does that mean for the smaller wounds that still remain unhealed in your own life? And that question does not resolve immediately, because instead, the message begins to move into something even deeper, something that brings identity and forgiveness together, suggesting that understanding who you are in God's eyes is what makes this kind of freedom possible in the first place. Because if you truly believe you are loved, known, and held by something greater than your wounds, then your wounds no longer have ultimate authority over your identity. But that truth is not fully unpacked yet, because now the message begins to shift again, moving from healing and forgiveness into something more structural, something more foundational about the human person itself. And it introduces a powerful idea that you are not only created, but created with intention, created with dignity, created with a purpose that existed before your awareness of it. And that means your value is not something you earn, but something you reflect. But even that idea creates tension. Because if your value is given, then the entire system of comparison, achievement, and self-justification begins to lose its authority. And that is where the message begins to push toward a final confrontation, not with others, but with the self, because now the real question is not what the world says about you, not what your past says about you, but what you will choose to believe about yourself when all those voices are competing at once. And just as that question begins to fully form, the message slows again, not to end, but to prepare for the next layer, because what comes next will take everything discussed so far and push it into one final, unavoidable realization about purpose, mission, and the life you are actually meant to live. And that is where everything begins to converge. But the final revelation is still ahead, because now everything comes down to a single unavoidable realization, one that cannot stay theoretical anymore, one that cannot remain safely in the background of your thoughts, because it demands a response from the way you actually live your life from this moment forward. And that realization is this: if your identity is truly rooted in God, then your life cannot be treated as something ordinary, random, or directionless anymore, because something has already been placed inside you that was meant to be lived out, not just believed in. And this is where the message finally brings everything together, because identity was never meant to be the end of the conversation. It was always the beginning of something larger, something active, something that moves you out of confusion and into responsibility, out of fear and into clarity, out of passivity and into mission. But even here, the tension does not disappear, because understanding identity is one thing, but living from it is something completely different. And that is where most people struggle, not in knowing truth, but in consistently becoming aligned with it when life gets loud again. And so the message begins to press into that reality, suggesting that every person carries a mission that is not generic, not copied, not interchangeable, but deeply personal, something that cannot be fulfilled by anyone else in exactly the same way. And if it is ignored, something remains incomplete in the world that was meant to come through you. And that idea adds weight to existence itself, because suddenly life is no longer just about survival or comfort. It becomes about faithfulness, about awareness, about recognizing that you are part of something bigger than your own immediate desires. But that awareness also creates tension, because it forces a confrontation between what you feel like doing and what you are actually meant to do. And those two paths are not always aligned, especially when clarity is still growing inside you. And this is where the message becomes more practical, more grounded, because it suggests that identity in God is not sustained by a single moment of understanding, but by daily return, daily alignment, daily surrender, where you continuously choose to live from truth even when the world pulls you toward distraction. And that is why the idea of receiving becomes so important again. Because before you act, before you go, before you build, before you serve. There must be a moment of receiving, a moment of allowing something higher than yourself to shape your direction for the day ahead. Because otherwise, even good intentions can become misaligned activity, and even sincere effort can become exhausting if it is disconnected from source. And so the message begins to show a rhythm of life that is not based on constant doing, but on being filled first, then moving, then returning again, like a cycle of receiving and responding instead of striving and burning out. And within that rhythm, something changes internally because anxiety begins to lose some of its control. Not because life becomes easier, but because life becomes understood differently, as something carried with you rather than something you carry alone. And that shift creates a kind of freedom that most people rarely experience because it is not dependent on circumstances changing, but on identity being remembered. And then the message moves into something more challenging again, because it begins to suggest that spiritual strength is not built in moments of comfort, but in consistency, in discipline, in small daily decisions that slowly reshape who you are becoming. And that is where the idea of holiness is reintroduced, not as perfection, but as direction, not as never failing, but as slowly moving away from what diminishes you and toward what aligns you with truth. And that means progress becomes more important than perfection, because transformation is measured not in sudden change, but in steady movement away from old patterns and toward new life. But even here, the message does not allow complacency, because it warns that the mind itself is the primary battlefield, that what enters your thoughts eventually shapes your desires, and what shapes your desires eventually shapes your actions. And so what you repeatedly expose yourself to becomes spiritually significant, because it is either reinforcing truth or slowly reshaping perception without you noticing. And that is where responsibility becomes unavoidable, because now you are not just a passive receiver of life, you are actively shaping the inner environment that determines how you interpret everything around you. And as that realization deepens, the message begins to point toward the idea that growth is not accidental, it is intentional, it is chosen, it is fought for, and it is protected through awareness, discipline, and alignment. And that is where everything begins to converge for the final time. Because identity, forgiveness, suffering, purpose, and mission are no longer separate ideas. They are all part of one integrated reality, a life that is meant to be lived consciously in alignment with God, rather than unconsciously shaped by everything else. And so the final question is not about information anymore. It is about decision, not about what you understand, but about what you will live from now on. Because if what has been spoken is true, even in part, then you are not simply a person trying to get through life. You are a person carrying something eternal into time, something that cannot be replaced, something that matters more than you have been led to believe by the noise of the world. And that means the real ending is not here, because the story does not end with understanding. It ends with response. And what you choose to do with this truth is where your real story actually begins.